Right off the bat, let me paint you a picture of the night everything started to change. Picture this. A business gala, swarming with the city's finest, glitz, glam, and wealth oozing out of every corner. And there he was, standing out by not trying to stand out at all. Dressed simply among the sea of tuxedos and glittering dresses, he had this quiet confidence about him that caught my eye. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, it was like he had the secret, knowing he didn't need the flash to be noticed. And notice him, I did. Fast forward a bit, and our courtship flew by in a whirlwind. I mean, the man was like a walking dream, kind, attentive, and oh, did I mention loaded? When he popped the question at this ultra-private dinner, overlooking the city lights with a ring that was simplicity and elegance rolled into one, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Yes, couldn't leave my lips fast enough. We got hitched and moved into this sprawling estate that was something straight out of a magazine. Every day felt like I was living in a dream. My days were filled with planning parties, shopping sprees, and basically living it up. I bragged to anyone who'd listen about how I'd snagged a life of luxury by marrying him. It was all so easy, or so I thought. Then came the prenup talk. He brought it up casually after the wedding, calling it a mere formality. Me? I brushed it off like it was nothing. In my head, I was in control, and those assets might as well have been mine already. But here's the thing, despite all his wealth, he was all about giving back. Volunteering, donating to shelters, you name it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why waste your fortune on others when you can grow it? I'd nag him, pushing for more luxury, more everything. He'd just smile that calm smile and continue with his charity work. I saw it as a weakness. He's too soft, I tell my friends, convinced he'd never dare to leave the cushy life I gave him. Boy, was I living in a bubble. His business trips picked up pace, leaving me to my own devices in our mansion. And I loved it, throwing parties, living the high life without him breathing down my neck. It felt like freedom. But let's be real, freedom came with its own set of blinds. I was so caught up in my world of extravagance, I missed the signs. The man was slipping away, and I was too busy flaunting my status to notice. It was all about the image, the prestige, the look at me lifestyle. And in my twisted view, his absence was just another opportunity to shine solo. Reflecting on those days, it's clear I was dancing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded by my own greed. Each lavish party, each dismissive laugh at his generosity, was a step closer to the edge. And all the while, he watched in silence, his quiet confidence morphing into a resolve I was too self-absorbed to see. It was a game of chess I didn't even know we were playing. And as it turns out, he was always several moves ahead. The day he asked me to take a closer look at our finances, I laughed it off. Come on, we're not one of those couples who needs to nickel and dime, I said, brushing aside his concerns like they were just another one of his eccentric quirks. My lifestyle, our lifestyle, demanded a certain level of spending, and I wasn't about to start pinching pennies. But then, he caught me red-handed, mid-splurge on yet another designer bag that I absolutely did not need, but absolutely had to have. I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked in. Disappointment mixed with a hint of disbelief. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. That look said it all. And me? I just shrugged it off and continued with my day, convinced he'd get over it. As time went on, he began to pull away, burying himself in his work. I told myself he was just busy, too caught up in the grind to worry about my spending habits. It was easier than facing the truth. Then the whispers started. Financial trouble, they said. I laughed louder than anyone. Us? In financial trouble? Impossible. The money was endless, it had to be. I waved away their concerns with a flick of my perfectly manicured hand and planned another party. But he wasn't playing along anymore. We need to cut back, he told me one night, his voice firm, a stark contrast to his usual easygoing nature. I stared at him, incredulous. Cut back? Are you kidding? What are you hiding? I accused. Sure that he was stashing away money for himself, keeping me out of the loop. He didn't get angry. Instead, he did something far worse. He sat me down and showed me the numbers. Our accounts, the ones I thought were bottomless, were bleeding out, drained by my constant demands. It's all going, he said quietly, pointing to the stark figures. I couldn't believe it. You're lying, I shot back, unable to accept that our empire was crumbling. But the bombshell was yet to come. One evening, after I'd spent hours arguing about why we couldn't possibly cancel my upcoming soiree, he handed me a folder. Look, he urged, and for once, I did. Inside were statements, documents, all pointing to the same grim reality. Our wealth wasn't liquid, it was tied up in investments, properties, and yes, charitable foundations. The truth hit me like a slap. All this time, I'd been living in a fantasy, spending money that wasn't really there, ignoring his attempts to make me see reason. And there he was, trying to protect not just our future, but the commitments he'd made to causes far bigger than our next party. I looked up from the papers, finally ready to listen, but the damage was done. The gap between us had widened into a chasm, filled with my denials and his disappointments. In my quest for more, I'd failed to see the most valuable thing I had. And now, I wasn't sure if it was too late to start digging us out of the hole I'd so carelessly thrown us into. Just when I thought things couldn't get any crazier, I stumbled upon a document he'd carelessly left out. It was a detailed plan to liquidate some of our assets. My first thought, sweet, he's finally getting his act together to fund my desires. Boy, was I wrong. The notes scribbled on the margins about financial recovery went completely over my head. I was too caught up in my fantasy world to see the red flags waving right in front of me. Then the unthinkable started happening. One by one, his precious luxury items began disappearing. The fancy cars, the designer watches, even some of the artwork that used to adorn our walls. To me, it seemed like a temporary fix. We'll get them back in no time, I told myself, completely oblivious to the depth of our financial sinkhole. His whole vibe changed too. Gone was the laid-back guy the first married, replaced by someone who was practically a stranger. He was distant, buried in his work like it was the only thing that mattered. I mistook his quiet desperation for dedication, thinking he was just on a mission to rebuild our empire. How naive I was. Even when a close friend pulled me aside, hinting that he was considering some drastic moves to salvage our finances, I just laughed it off. He wouldn't dare, I thought, so sure of my grip on him and our lifestyle. But then came the reality check. I had this grand plan for an international getaway, imagining us sipping cocktails on some exotic beach. When I floated the idea by him, expecting the usual nod, he shut it down immediately. We can't afford it, he said, no room for negotiation. I was livid. What do you mean we can't afford it? Are you some kind of fraud? I accused, my voice dripping with disdain. He just stood there, silent, the weight of his resignation hanging between us. But he wasn't done trying. In a last-ditch effort to make me see sense, he arranged a meeting with a financial advisor. Let's manage our expenses together, he suggested, hoping to bring me back to reality. I saw it as a slap in the face. Manage expenses? Do I look like I need to budget? I stormed out, fueled by a mix of anger and denial, leaving him standing in the middle of our crumbling world. Looking back, each of these moments was a crossroads, a chance to turn things around. But I was too wrapped up in my own version of reality to take them. Each action, each warning sign, was a piece of the puzzle I refused to put together. And as our world continued to fall apart, I clung to the fantasy, unwilling to face the truth that was staring back at me. The day the bills started piling up was the day I should have realized our castle was built on sand. Envelopes stamped with "Final Notice" and "Past Due" became my dirty little secrets, shoved into drawers and under piles of magazines. I was too ashamed to admit the truth, even to myself. Our lavish lifestyle, once the envy of everyone we knew, was crumbling around us, and I was too proud to face it. But he had other plans. Plans that didn't involve hiding in the shadows of our debts. He called a family meeting, laying bare the skeleton of our financial ruin for all to see. There, in front of the very people whose admiration I craved, he peeled back the curtain on our mess. I was mortified, feeling utterly betrayed. How could he air our dirty laundry like that? The aftermath was brutal. My family's disappointment cut deeper than any unpaid bill. Yet, in my pride, I found a scapegoat in him. It was easier to blame his mismanagement than to admit my part in our downfall. "You're the reason we're in this mess," I accused, deflecting my guilt onto him. His response was a cold, part ultimatum. "We downsize, or we're done," he said, his voice void of the warmth it once held. I laughed in his face, calling his bluff. There was no way I'd give up my designer clothes and fancy cars, not for him, not for anyone. Behind my back, he was making moves. Meetings with lawyers, quiet discussions about the future, our future, which he seemed increasingly convinced didn't include me. I was oblivious, continuing my charade of affluence even as our empire was auctioned off piece by piece. Then came the bombshell, dropped casually over coffee by a friend who could no longer keep his secret. "He's planning to leave you," she said, her eyes filled with a mix of pity and concern. "And he's taking everything with him." I scoffed, dismissing her words as mere gossip. My husband, leave me? Impossible. I was too confident in my control, too blinded by arrogance to see the writing on the wall. The change in him was palpable. The man I married, once vibrant and full of life, had become a ghost of his former self. His warmth had turned to ice, his love replaced by a distant resignation. I mistook his detachment for weakness, foolishly believing I could twist him around my finger once more. But the final blow was yet to come. One ordinary morning, amidst the facade of normalcy, he handed me an envelope. Not another bill, but something far more definitive: divorce papers. Citing irreconcilable differences and my flagrant disregard for our financial well-being, he was cutting the cord. I stared at the documents in disbelief, the reality of his decision slicing through my denial like a knife. The realization that my actions, my refusal to acknowledge our reality, had driven us to this point was a bitter pill to swallow. There, in the silence of our once happy home, surrounded by the trappings of a life we could no longer afford, the truth hit me. My reckless spending, my stubborn pride, had cost me everything. And as he walked away, leaving me with nothing but the echo of our past, I understood the true price of my folly. When he slapped those divorce papers on the table, something in me just refused to take it seriously. I laughed it off, a knee-jerk reaction to what I thought was just another one of his attempts to scare me straight. He'll never go through with it, I told myself, convinced more than ever that this was all just a dramatic play for control, a final stand in a game I was sure I was winning. But then, he did something I never saw coming. He packed up his things, just a few personal items, and walked out of our once shared estate. The mansion that had been a symbol of our lavish lifestyle suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too empty. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room the moment he left, and I was left to wander the halls alone, surrounded by all the luxury that now felt like nothing more than gilded cages. Determined to fight back, I hired a lawyer. I was sure I could challenge the prenup, convinced that there was no way he could leave me with nothing. My lawyer, though, wasn't so optimistic. "This is going to be a tough fight," he warned me, but I brushed off his concerns. I was too caught up in my own narrative of victimhood and entitlement. Court was a rude awakening. There he was, calm and collected, laying out the terms of the prenup I had so carelessly signed, too blinded by love and greed to pay attention to the details. It was ironclad, protecting not only the wealth he had before we married but also anything he'd earn afterward. I had been so sure of my place by his side, so confident in the empire we'd built together, that I hadn't considered the possibility of it all crumbling down. The judge's ruling was like a punch to the gut. I was left with a fraction of what I had expected, my lavish lifestyle reduced to a memory overnight. As I sat there, numb and disbelieving, I realized just how much I had overplayed my hand. Then came the final blow. He sold the estate, the very heart of our extravagant life together, and all I got was a modest some €2 start anew. It was a fraction of what I had once thrown around without a second thought. Watching my dreams of luxury fade away was a bitter pill to swallow, a stark reminder of the consequences of my actions. But what hurt the most wasn't the loss of wealth or status, it was watching him from afar, seeing him rebuild his life without me. He invested wisely, lived modestly, and slowly but surely, his reputation in the community was restored. People admired him for his resilience, his generosity, and his ability to start over. Meanwhile, I was left in the shadows, grappling with the reality of my situation. I had underestimated him, taken his love and his patience for granted, and now I was paying the price. The man I had mocked for his euro weakness had shown a strength and wisdom I couldn't even begin to match. As I navigated my new reality, living off the modest sum he had left me, I couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and regret. He had emerged from our tumultuous marriage with his dignity intact, while I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered ego and squandered opportunities. Who knew the high life could crash so hard? There I was, scraping by, trying to hold on to any shred of the lifestyle I once took for granted. My bank account bled out from the lavish habits I couldn't shake, each swipe of the card digging me deeper into a hole I had no idea how to climb out of. Trying to slip back into our old social circles was like walking into a wall of ice. News of my downfall had spread like wildfire, painting me as the villain in his triumphant story of survival. The looks of pity mixed with disdain were almost worse than the outright rejections. I had become a pariah, an outcast from the world I once ruled. It hit me then, the full weight of what I'd lost. Not the money or the status, but him, the man whose strength I had mistaken for weakness, whose love I had squandered. That realization was a gut punch, leaving me reeling with regret but no closer to redemption. Meanwhile, he was on every front page, the phoenix rising from our ashes. He'd launched a new venture, and it was a hit. The stories weren't just about his success, they were about his comeback, his resilience. I watched from the shadows, my heart aching with envy and regret for what could have been. I tried reaching out, desperate for a bridge over the chasm I'd created. But every attempt was met with silence. The door was firmly shut, the finality of his departure a bitter pill I was forced to swallow alone. In a last-ditch effort to stay afloat, I sold off the luxury items I had clung to. Each sale was a band-aid on a bullet wound, barely making a dent in the debts that loomed over me. The jewels, the clothes, the handbags, all gone, one by one, until all that was left were the memories of better days. The news of his remarriage was a quiet affair, but it echoed loudly in my empty world. He had found someone who shared his values, a stark contrast to the superficial life we had led together. It was a happiness I had never given him, a truth that stunned more than any loss of wealth. My legal battles to claw back some of his assets were futile. Each failed attempt drained what little I had left, leaving me with nothing but legal fees and a growing sense of despair. Eventually, he moved abroad, cutting all ties with the life we had shared. I was left behind, a ghost haunting the remnants of our past, facing the consequences of my choices alone. The friends who once flocked to our lavish parties, drawn by the allure of our wealth, vanished. Their abandonment was the final nail in the coffin of my social standing. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in my life. The move to a modest apartment was the last step in my descent. Gone were the mansions, the sprawling estates, replaced by four walls that felt more like a prison than a home. My fall from grace was complete, a stark reminder of how far I had come, and how far I had fallen. In the quiet solitude of my new reality, I reflected on the irony of my situation. I had coveted his wealth, only to end up with nothing but the bitter memories of my greed. The luxury, the parties, the endless spending €1, all of it felt like a distant dream, a fleeting illusion that had slipped through my fingers. As I watched the sunset from my small balcony, the finality of my loss washed over me. He had left, taking his riches and the last shred of my dignity with him. My journey of betrayal and greed hadn't led me to a new beginning, it had dragged